Okay, we're going to talk now about miracles and synchronicities. Closely related, sometimes confused with each other, but even if we don't solve today the question of whether these things actually happen, we can use the resources of analytic philosophy to help us at least get straight on some definitions and make some fine distinctions and clarifications. Starting with miracles, we could, in trying to define what a miracle is, what is it we're talking about when we talk about miracles, it's helpful to distinguish between these two aspects of miracles. Now, I chose the word aspects. Could have also used the word facets or angles on miracles. Instead of the word kinds, I didn't want to say we have two kinds of miracles here because I would say every miracle or every, let's call it a supposed or putative or claimed miracle, has a supposed or claimed or putative subjective aspect. And by this we just mean the experiential aspect of the miracle. How the miracle makes us feel when we see it, or maybe more commonly, hear about it or read about it. So, for example, the feeling of wonder and amazement would be primary in the subjective aspect of the miracle. Perhaps also a feeling of gratitude if the miracle did something good for us, like heal us or bring us rain in a time of drought. We might feel gratitude to the supposed author of the miracle, some kind of deity, perhaps. So we're just talking about the feelings around our experience of miracles when we talk about the subjective aspect of the miracle. And we can contrast that subjective aspect with the surprise, surprise, objective aspect of the miracle. And by the objective aspect of the miracle, we simply mean what the miracle is in and of itself out there in the world. Okay? Forget about our feelings around it. Forget about our emotional, social, psychological reaction to the miracle and just concentrate on what is supposed to be going on with the occurrence of the miracle. We call that the objective. Thinking of the miracle as this kind of object or event out there in the world. And it's really this objective aspect that's, should I say, controversial. It's certainly the aspect we'll be focusing on today. I mean, put it this way: there's no doubt that there's a subjective reaction people have to supposed miracles. You can perhaps consult your own experience. Perhaps there's some amazing things you've heard about or witnessed, and no one's doubting that you have those feelings around the miracle. No one's doubting the reports about miracles, meaning no one's doubting that there are those reports and that people feel amazed and wonder around these miracles. The debatable part of miracles is whether objectively in the world there is something that has happened which deserves the name miracle. So what is it we're talking about objectively when we talk about a miracle having occurred? Okay. Uh, don't don't worry about trying to take this argument all in at once. We're going to go through this line by line. This is sort of the centerpiece of our discussion of miracles today. This is a very famous, or some would say infamous, argument against miracles. More precisely, it's an argument trying to show that belief in miracles is irrational, unreasonable. Okay. In fact, it very ambitiously tries to show that belief in miracles is always, I would almost say, is necessarily irrational. Okay. And this is an argument from David Hume, one of the great skeptics in the history of philosophy. And apparently, I mean, a little bit of interesting history about this argument. David Hume held back from publishing this argument in his earliest work. He wrote a work when he was in his 20s. I think he was 24 when his Treatise of Human Nature was published. He was sort of a philosophical prodigy, I guess you could say. And apparently he had this argument in his back pocket even at that time, but he refrained from publishing it in that first work, concerned about offending the religious sensibilities of his peers and the general populace, or the reading populace, who would have been reading his philosophical treatise. But it eventually came out in a later work, and it's generated much discussion in the decades and indeed centuries since it was published. Just jumping to the conclusion here, just to see where we're going. The conclusion is that the evidence for a miracle is always going to be outweighed by the evidence against it. Okay, always. So notice the generality of Hume's ambition here. It's a general argument against belief in miracles. He's not talking about any particular miracle. I mean, we can debate reported miracles case by case and look at the evidence for and against and talk about the specific circumstances of each. But Hume is kind of performing that philosophical power move of zooming right out and showing us that miracle belief will always lose in the rationality contest with skepticism. Okay, but we were talking just a moment ago about this distinction between subjective and objective aspects of a miracle. And the question was what we mean by the objective aspect of a miracle. And here Hume tells us in the first premise that a miracle is, by definition, a rare violation of natural law by a deity, by a god of some kind. If you're a Christian, it's going to be capital G God, but in principle, or in theory, a miracle could be performed by any being who's supernatural. Supernatural meaning above or beyond or greater than nature. And actually, supernatural is a pretty good definition of a deity. A deity would be a supernatural agent of some kind, a being who has some kind of power over nature because they've got some kind of foothold outside of it, or scope over it. And when we say a miracle is, by definition, you can read that as a miracle in its objective aspect is, by definition, a rare violation, breaking of natural law by a deity. Okay. Well, what's a natural law then? Really, I mean, when you meditate on that first premise, I think that the natural next question is, as so often happens when we define a tricky word, in the defining phrase itself, there's another tricky word. And then we have to ask, well, what is that second tricky word here? Well, here we've defined miracle, and then we're given this term natural law, and that should make us scratch our chin and ask, well, what is a natural law exactly? What are we? Well, we kind of know what we're talking about, surely, and we can give examples like Newton's laws in physics, or E equals mc squared, or we can talk about more specific laws or patterns like what happens when you combine sodium and chlorine, using the chemical rules of combination that we discover in chemistry. Well, our second premise gives us the answer. A natural law is, by definition, a pattern of behavior we have vast evidence for. Okay. The word behavior here is maybe a little misleading. I guess I chose this word, if I remember correctly. And usually we use the word behavior when we're talking about conscious, intentional agents like ourselves, like human behavior or animal behavior. But we could think of the word behavior in a more general sense as just activity of some kind, And by natural law, we mean natural law is a pattern of behavior in the natural world. Okay, now that could be at the level of physics, it could be at the level of biology. But by the time we call it a natural law, it means we've got a lot of evidence for it. Like we've noticed this pattern, and to notice the pattern means we've noticed a certain behavior repeated many, many times, right? And when we observe over the course of our lives and over the course of our species, and especially when we observe it in that very precise, systematized, recorded, shared way we do in science, we have many, 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 many examples of that pattern being followed in the natural world. Yeah. And so when we notice that pattern, we say, we've discovered a natural law. A natural law is just what we call one of these patterns of behavior in the natural world. Okay. So, I mean, this is going to be enough to get us to a conclusion. I mean, which is remarkable because premise one just gives us a definition of what a miracle is. It's just premise one is just a definition of what a miracle is. Premise two is just a definition of what a natural law is. And Hume is saying, from defining our terms clearly, we should see that the evidence for a miracle is going to always be outweighed by the evidence against it. This just follows by the very definition of our key terms. A miracle is a violation of natural law. But a natural law is, by definition, a pattern we've got lots and lots of evidence for. So when you're asking, did a miracle happen in the objective sense? Was a natural law violated? Hume says, if you think about what you're asking, you'll see what the answer should be. The answer should be no, it wasn't violated. A miracle is by definition a rare violation of natural law, right? It's the exception, which means it's the thing we've got very little evidence for. We just have the one example. The natural law is the thing we've got vast evidence for. So you got to choose. You got to, the question, when there's a supposed reported miracle that has happened, and you're being asked to believe in it, what you're being asked to believe is that the thing with less evidence happened, right? In effect, when we call something a natural law, we say it's a pattern that occurs without violation. Mhm. A pattern of behavior that occurs without violation. And then someone says there's been a violation. Well, that's one experience against the vast experience of humanity for the inviolable pattern. And so the evidence for miracles always outweighed by the evidence against it. A very interesting argument, partly by its power, partly by the fact that just by this neat trick of defining our terms clearly, we seem to be able to just dismiss all talk of objective miracles. Also, part of Hume's discussion of miracles is this historical, cultural, social, psychological discussion of why people believe in miracles. Okay. And he notes a few things. First of all, notice that our reports of miracles tend not to come from experts, says Hume. They originate. No, this is Hume's slightly offensive language. He says among ignorant and barbarous nations. If we could translate Hume here, he means reports of miracles come from pre-scientific cultures or cultures that exist outside the sphere of modern science, for the most part. Right, and this should make us suspicious a little bit. Second, we should notice that even if miracles weren't true, they might spread because we get a lot of pleasure from hearing about these stories, and we get a lot of pleasure and we get a lot of social reward for telling of these miracles. In other words, I mean, if miracles actually don't happen, if we accept Hume's argument from the previous slide, the question then is, well, why do we have so many stories of miracles? And that's what Hume is trying to answer here. Yeah, he's trying to show us that even if they don't actually happen, there'd be good reason for belief in miracles to perpetuate. And we have many confirmed frauds or errors, so purported miracles that turn out to be false. So claimed violations of natural law that upon investigation or with further evidence coming to light with the course of time turn out to be frauds or errors. One example that comes to mind, I was reading recently a history of the Jim Jones religious movement. Jim Jones was a charismatic Christian Marxist church leader who initially had a church, where was it? Somewhere in Indiana and then California, and then they moved down to Guyana, I believe. And sadly and notoriously, there was a mass murder / suicide at the Jonestown compound in, I think it was Guyana. This was in the late 70s, I believe. Anyway, that's the Jonestown cult, the Jonestown Massacre. It's sometimes called a horrific episode in American religious history. And well before they went down to Guyana, they were riding around in a big tour bus and holding these rallies where Jim Jones would perform purported healing miracles. He'd reach into the back of an ailing congregationist and pull out a supposed cancerous tumor and hold it up for the congregation to see and then throw it in a pail. And, well, members of the Jonestown cult or group reported later that when they would arrive in a town, they would make a visit to the local butcher or chicken slaughterhouse and get some chicken guts. And Jim Jones would palm that and use the chicken guts in this supposed healing rite. And so the chicken gut was the supposed cancerous tumor being pulled out from the patient. I guess the patient was being fooled too in most cases, but so that would be a case of a confirmed fraud. Well, in the case of the people who innocently believe, that would be the case of an error, meaning people watching the crowd who believe that Jones is actually performing a healing miracle would, in innocent error, believe that they'd witnessed a miracle, something which you could say violates the laws of medicine or biology. Exactly what those laws would be, I'll leave up to an expert in medicine or biology to elucidate. But we get these confirmations of frauds or errors. Now, we don't have, for every reported miracle in the history of humanity, we don't have a later confirmation that it was a fraud or an error. But maybe that's unreasonable to expect. Right, investigation is difficult, and when we get many or some confirmations of frauds, that could give us some suspicion that maybe fraud or error is going on in lots of the other cases, maybe all of them, right? So here's a quote from Mr. Hume. When anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable. So what's more probable? That's the key question here. That this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact he relates should really have happened. So what's more likely, that a dead man came to life, or that the person speaking about this supposed miracle is deceiving or was deceived? And given these kinds of considerations, and I don't think we've got a complete list here, but these kinds of social psychological considerations, and given Hume's central argument from the previous slide, I think it's clear what the answer is that Hume has in mind. Yeah. Okay. Objections. We know the drill. Present an argument, and then we look at objections to the argument. We're going to look at 3 objections here. Here's an objection from a philosopher of the name Ott, from an article he published in 1996. Our evidence for natural law is evidence for how nature behaves when God doesn't interfere. That evidence says nothing regarding how nature behaves were God to interfere. Okay. Remember Hume's definition of a miracle. A miracle is a violation of natural law by a deity. Okay. Now, Hume's definition of a natural law is a pattern of behavior in nature for which we've got a vast amount of evidence. But according to Ott, all that vast evidence for the pattern is really just evidence of how nature behaves when gods aren't playing around with nature. Okay. And a miracle is, as Hume acknowledged in that definition, a miracle is precisely that moment when gods are interfering with nature or, getting involved. So all that vast evidence for the natural law, it's not evidence against miracles. It's just evidence for the normal course of nature. It tells us nothing about how we should expect nature to behave when gods are interfering, which is precisely what's going on when a miracle occurs. Okay, so, I mean, Hume's argument, I called it possibly infamous or notorious. By that, I mean, I could mean a couple of things. I could mean, of course, it's an offensive argument to the pious, but also, you know, like the ontological argument for God, when we come to an extraordinary, powerful conclusion on the basis of just, you know, definitions alone, which is what happens in the ontological argument, right? If you just define the term God clearly, you will see that God exists. That's extraordinary if that's true, if that's how it works. But we might be suspicious that belief in God could be so easy, you know. And similarly with Hume's argument, we might say, wow, wouldn't it be something if we could really show that belief in miracles is never reasonable? Just by defining our terms, miracle and natural law, clearly. That seems maybe too easy, and that might make us suspicious. So I think some of the notoriety around Hume's argument is generated from the suspicion that Hume is getting away with something here. And I think these objections, at least some of them that you'll see around discussion of Hume, are trying to pin down exactly what Hume is getting away with in this argument. We saw a similar kind of suspicion with the ontological argument. Yeah. So I think Ott is trying to, again, show that if we actually think a second time, think a bit more clearly about what these definitions imply, you know, miracle and natural law, we don't get Hume's conclusion. Okay. So here's a second objection. In the Wikipedia page on Hume's argument, you'll see that the name Campbell from the 1800s is given, but this is a kind of objection that has, I guess, had various authors over the years. Hume's argument is circular, and circular is usually bad. When you argue in a circle, you are presuming in your premises, often in a unnoticed or maybe sneaky way, you're assuming in your premises the very thing you're supposed to be getting to in your conclusion, right? A good argument should take you to a conclusion from independent premises. It shouldn't build that conclusion into the premises. Otherwise, you've got a kind of circular argument. I'm not sure if circle's the best metaphor there, but anyway, there's a kind of logical circularity there. Yeah. So Hume says that belief in laws of nature, our belief in this kind of consistency, patterns of nature, is warranted by exceptionless testimony. Okay. I mean, he kind of built that into the definition of natural law. Natural laws are those patterns we've observed to be followed in the natural world without exception. We've got that vast history of testimony and reportage and data for those patterns. But the testimony for that law of nature is exceptionless only if testimony for miracles is ruled out, right? I mean, take this quasi law that the dead don't come back to life. You know, Once dead, you don't come back to life. Now, you might say that's a kind of law of nature, law of biological or medical nature, warranted by exceptionless testimony, but it's not. We have many reports of people coming back to life. Now, you might have some doubts about those reports for Humean or other reasons, but it's not true that the testimony is exceptionless around the question of whether the dead come back to life. We've got, I think, several examples in the Bible alone, don't we? At least two, Jesus and Lazarus, but there might be others. And globally, there are many accounts of people coming back from the dead, like in the yogic tradition, which we'll talk about in a moment. So there's a circularity in Hume's argument in that by the very way Hume is defining laws of nature, it's ruling out miracles. Yeah. I mean, you're trying to show in the argument that miracles don't happen, but in fact you're building into one of your premises, the premise which defines law of nature, that miracles can't happen. So that's the circularity of Hume's argument. And here's a third objection. Now, I call it an objection with caution. It comes from another famous English philosopher named John Stuart Mill. And I call it an objection with caution because Mill is actually giving his own argument against belief in miracles. Okay. And Mill goes further than Hume, in a sense. Mill says that by their very definition, miracles are impossible. Not just that by their definition, we shouldn't believe in them in comparison to natural law. Mill says, by their very definition, miracles are impossible, meaning a natural law is by definition an exceptionless pattern of behavior. And so the idea of a violation, of a natural law is incoherent, according to Mill. Can't have a violation of a natural law. Okay, so has Mill therefore shown that the dead, by definition, could never come back to life? No. Rather, according to Mill, a supposed miracle, a reported miracle, a purported miracle may be due to a law, natural law, not seen to apply. So there's some law in our books, in our physics books or biology books, and if we could just understand how it connects to the current situation, we'd see that it's not a miracle that's happening. It's actually in accordance with some law we've already discovered. Or we don't know everything. We're still exploring nature. Maybe we've explored 1% of it. Maybe if you think of discovering natural laws as a kind of digging down to the foundations of nature, who knows how far down we've gone. Maybe we're just still digging around in the first top inches of topsoil, and there are miles and miles to excavate still in the annals of natural law. And so what we think is a miracle, what we call a miracle, and what doesn't fit with our current understanding of nature may in fact be due to a law we've yet to discover. Okay. So on the one hand, Mill is saying miracles are by definition impossible. But on the other hand, we can see there's a kind of openness in Mill's account here to extraordinary things happening. I mean, in the Millian account, whatever J.S. Mill himself thought, in a kind of Mill-style approach to miracles, we could say, okay, there's this report of a dead man coming back to life. Well, perhaps it happened. If it did happen, it's due to something going on in medical biology we just don't understand, either because we don't see how our current textbook could explain this, or there's something going on we just don't understand in the human body and its relation to the environment. So Mill's account, in other words, is open to extraordinary things happening. But Mill would prefer to... Here's Mill in a nutshell. If a purported miracle happens, and let's say we've got pretty reliable evidence for it too, meaning very reliable testimony, recordings of it maybe on YouTube. The question is, have we witnessed a miracle where a miracle is a violation of natural law? Mill says, well, no, it's definitely not a miracle because miracles are impossible by definition. Natural laws can't be violated. What's going on is that what we thought was a natural law isn't a natural law. Our understanding is limited. There's some law operating here we haven't discovered yet. Okay, so miracles could be clues that our understanding of nature is not complete. So, we began Hume's argument by trying to define what miracles in their objective aspect are, and we went with this definition of a miracle as a violation of natural law. But another way of thinking about miracles, or whatever we want to call them at this point, is they're expressions of higher laws, or subtle, deeper natural laws that we have a limited understanding of, right? In the yogic Indian tradition, there's this idea of siddhis. A siddhi is a yogic power. It's a power that a practitioner of yoga will acquire on the path to enlightenment, let's say. Sometimes these siddhis are spoken of as almost unintentional byproducts of spiritual progress, that you're seeking liberation, spiritual liberation in your deep meditative practice and your asanas and your sadhanas, your rigorous spiritual practice. And almost as like the sparks thrown off from this spiritual fire, you acquire these powers like power of foresight to sense the future, power to levitate, maybe power to heal through touch, and power to teleport and bilocate. I mean, I'm not saying these things actually happen, but the yogic accounts are full of these kinds of supposed extraordinary actions, happenings by advanced yogic individuals, gurus and sadhus and whatnot. And I think that in this tradition, these powers are not seen as violations of natural law. It's not that the yogi has gained a godlike ability to violate the natural world. Rather, they've become in touch with some deeper current of pattern in nature. There are higher, deeper patterns of nature, subtle energies that the yogi has contact with, and now they can channel and manipulate, kind of almost in the way that when we understand physics at a new level, we unlock new technologies. Quantum physics unlocks new technologies, and the yogi, in going deeper and deeper into reality in the spiritual journey, unlocks new sort of spiritual technologies. So these yogic powers are like spiritual technologies, and yeah, they're not violations of natural law. So if that's what's going on, Hume's argument might be, well, I guess it wouldn't be irrelevant. I guess Hume could still say the weight of human experience is still for these kinds of things not happening, right? We've got lots and lots of experience of levitation not happening, and very little experience or reportage of levitation happening. And so we might still side with skepticism about levitation. I think that's kind of the Humean take on this kind of thing, which when you put it that way sounds commonsensical. But, common sense can also get dug in and become conservative and closed off to new experience. And, the history of science is full of people accepting a certain paradigm and refusing to accept exceptions into that paradigm, and history ends up proving the revolutionary correct, right? The exceptions were real and the old paradigm had to fall. And so we don't want to get too locked in to an understanding of the world and assume that nothing could ever happen which would violate the ordinary course of experience. I suppose what we'd want from the yogic siddhis is some kind of systematic account of what's going on, right? Until we've got that, they're just these weird exceptions which are hard to believe and make sense of. But if we can start to, in a kind of systematic, scientific way, understand what are these subtle energies, what are these subtle laws that the yogi is coming into contact with, then the occurrences might still be rare. Levitation might still be rare in the same way that solving a Rubik's Cube in under a minute is rare. It's something that very few people can do, but under a minute or 2 minutes or whatever it is, whatever the threshold is. Anyway, a final point here on miracles in connection to Mill is this idea of Clarke's third law. Clarke is Arthur C. Clarke, one of the great science fiction writers of the 20th century. Wrote the sort of script and novelization of 2001: A Space Odyssey, Childhood's End, Rendezvous with Rama, and a number of other short stories and novels. And Clarke, with tongue sort of in cheek, proposed a series of laws of, I think these were laws of cultural evolution. And I don't think anyone remembers what the first and second laws are, but the third law, Clarke's third law, is that advanced technology looks like magic. Cell phones get smaller and smaller and smaller until they're implanted in your brain, and it just looks like we're talking to each other across vast distances. It looks like magic, right? Somebody pushes a button and a nuclear bomb detonates 5 miles away. To the denizens of King Arthur's court, that would look like wizardry or magic. So technology, when it first arrives, is quite clunky. It's got big gears and it's heavy and it's cumbersome, and then it miniaturizes and it starts to look more and more just like hand magic. People waving their hands or speaking, and dramatic things happening in the exterior world by their command. So advanced technology looks like magic. If someone arrived here among us from the far future and were exhibiting their technology to us, it would look to us like magic. They would seem to us like a kind of wizard. And I think the point here is just that what looks like magic or what looks like a miracle to us might just be a kind of technology. Yeah. By technology, we mean the application of scientific understanding to some kind of practical purpose. Now, I'm not sure what the purpose of levitation is exactly, come to think of it, but something like miraculous healing would be more like, you know, a kind of medical technology, which may be grounded in some higher law. Yeah. Okay. Okay. We're talking about miracles and synchronicities. We've just talked about miracles, and now let's take the case of synchronicity. This term, I don't know if you've heard this term before. It's a fairly new term. That is, it was coined in the 20th century by the psychologist Carl Jung. That's Jung. And synchronicity, if I can detach it somewhat from Jung's full theoretical context, is some kind of rare and meaningful coincidence. In fact, if you look at the word coincidence, which means sort of happening together, the co mean together, and the incidents, the happening, that's really what synchronicity literally means. Synchronicity means at the same time. The crone here means time, and the sin means together or with. So when things happen together in a very rare and meaningful way, but there's no obvious sort of natural explanation for why they've happened together, we can call that a synchronicity. Now, coincidences happen all the time, right? I mean, and we accept that. And we accept that coincidences don't require any kind of special explanation, because when you got a lot of things happening all the time, which is what life is, which is what reality is, it's a world is a place where lots of things are happening all the time. Once in a while, odds are, just by pure dumb luck, you're going to get things which happen together in your experience, which strike you as funny or meaningful. So those are just, I want to distinguish between regular coincidences, which can make you laugh and go, and then the synchronicities, I think, are the really weird coincidences, which seem so meaningful and so unlikely that we feel they require a special word, and maybe a special explanation. Okay. Now, comparing synchronicities to miracles, I think the key distinction is that coincidences and synchronicities, meaning coincidences including the super special coincidences, which we call synchronicities, do not seem to violate natural law, which is very different from miracles in their objective aspect, right? We defined, following Hume, a miracle in its objective aspect to be some kind of apparent violation or disruption of the natural order of things, that some law of nature has been broken or put on pause while some deity does its wonder work. A very interesting thing about synchronicities is that there's no apparent violation of natural law, that if you look at the different elements of a synchronicity, and a synchronicity, like any coincidence, will always have multiple elements, right? For things to happen together, there have to be things. There have to be several things, at least two. And if you look at each of the elements that have come together in a synchronicity, and you ask, how did that happen? And then how did that happen? And how did that happen? what you'll find is that there's a plausible, natural or normal explanation available for each of those elements. What's weird in the synchronicity and what seems to require a special explanation is that all these things happen together. Okay. Um, but there's no apparent natural law that's been broken. So that's, objectively, in terms of what's going on out there, um, there's that very important difference between miracles and synchronicities. But having said that, I think the term synchronicity is a very new term. I suspect that if you look at the history of religious reportage, the reports and the testimonies of religious individuals, what we would today call synchronicities maybe got lumped in together with this more general category of miracles and wonders, And then as we, as scientific culture advances and evolves, and we develop a more kind of rigid understanding of the natural world as a system of law-abiding natural behavior, we see in dramatic contrast to that natural order any kind of disruption or any reported disruption. So I think it's especially in a scientific age, sort of ironically, that we have a very distinct idea of a miracle as a violation of natural law, right? You'd only think about a violation of natural law if you already had a fairly established sense of nature as a law-like or law-abiding system, right? And then, so then you can contrast these objective violations of natural law, call them miracles, with these synchronicities, these things which are very weird and maybe cry out for some kind of religious explanation, but do not seem to break any laws of nature as we understand them. Okay, so I think that's just at the level of definitions, distinguishing between synchronicities and then miracles in their objective aspect. But subjectively, synchronicities function a lot like miracles in their subjective aspect, right? Both miracles and synchronicities have this subjective aspect where we're talking about the effect of the objective event on experiencers like us, perceivers. And in both cases, there's a sense of wonder, synchronicity, even if in the end you don't adopt a religious explanation of it, will make you pause and go, wow, almost by definition, a synchronicity is distinguished from other coincidences by being a kind of coincidence that makes you stop and say, wow, and scratch your head and ask, how could this have happened? Okay, so synchronicities do arouse wonder and amazement in their receivers or experiencers, but objectively they've got this important difference from miracles. Okay, well, miracles, at least in the Hume style of definition, we ended up with at least looking at a Mill style of definition, which does not define miracles in that way. Or, sorry, I guess Mill would say, if a miracle is by definition a violation of natural law, then miracles by definition cannot happen because natural laws by definition cannot be violated. So yeah, I mean, put that way, I guess Mill accepts the Hume definition of miracle and then just argues that they can't happen. But anyway, okay. Miracles violate natural laws, synchronicities do not. But a synchronicity might lead you, compel you rationally to adopt a religious worldview to explain it. More specifically, it might lead you to conclude that the synchronicity as you experience it is the effect of some kind of divine ordering of your environment, that the synchronicity is some kind of communication to you, for example, from a god. And you can see that being depicted here. We sort of have the light of God, which includes, compressed in the electromagnetic beam, is information. And if you can kind of read the Latin, it says tolle lege, or maybe it says tolle et lege. Tolle lege means pick it up and read. So God is telling Saint Augustine, though I don't think he was saint yet here in his youth, to pick it up and read. Pick what up? Well, pick up the Bible. You can see his friend over here under a tree reading his own copy of, well, let's call it scripture rather than the Bible at this point. And why is God communicating this to Augustine at this time? Well, Augustine's, as he explains it in his autobiography, the Confessions, which is actually one of our first examples of a kind of book-length autobiography. This was written in around 400 years after Christ, and Augustine is telling the story in the Confessions, at least in this chapter of the Confessions, of how he kind of finally converted to Christianity. He had been toying with Christianity, but also toying in his 20s with some alternate philosophies and religions. And he'd also been kept off the Christian path, as he put it, by the temptations of the world. He was living in North Africa at that time. I think he was born in North Africa, and he had a mistress. I think he had a child by that mistress, and he was feeling the full, as a young person might, full force of the fleshly desires. He was feeling still pulled to the flesh and its demands, but there was this other part of him which wanted to leave that all behind and fully embrace a Christian path, which I think for him had a kind of monastic requirement. That is, that being a true Christian would involve, without remainder, devoting yourself and all your energy, every waking breath and moment, to God, and that would require a sacrifice of these fleshly desires and behaviors. I mean, we're talking about sex, right? And so he's having this, as he describes it, he's having this sort of dark night of the soul. Oh, he doesn't say dark night of the soul. In fact, it seems to be happening during the day, as the painting depicts. He's for whatever reason, things have come to a head. He's been feeling the stress of this contradiction in his soul. It's been building up. The pressure has been building up, and it all kind of comes out on this day. He sort of retires to a secluded part of this, sounds like a backyard, I think at his friend's house, was it? And he starts crying. He starts weeping uncontrollably, and he starts crying out to God. He's saying, how much longer, God? How much longer, will you torment me? How much longer till I can fully commit to you? And during a sort of moment of respite or calm in the midst of this wailing, he hears a voice. It seems to be a child's voice, and it's, just to be clear, this painting is a little bit misleading. Um, a child, an actual child, a couple of yards over, it sounds like, is singing a funny little song. In fact, just this little phrase, and it's not clear why the child is singing this particular phrase, but I imagine the child is just skipping around, lost in its own little world, and it's in a sing-songy way repeating this phrase "tole lege," which means pick it up and read. And Augustine interprets this to be a mediumship of God. That is, that the child, this voice, even though it's literally a child's voice, it is the voice of God. God is speaking through the child to Augustine, saying, hey, if you want a way out, pick it up and read. Pick up what? Well, Scripture was the only thing they'd been reading. I think he'd been discussing it with his friend. So he takes this to be God's command, not just pick up the Scripture and read it, but to open the Scripture to a random page. Just open it and read whatever it is that appears to you on the page there. Augustine mentions that he had heard of this kind of thing. It was a practice of divination, like almost like tarot card reading or reading palms, that you would take the Scripture and open it to a random page and then follow what the first text that would appear to you on that randomly selected page. The idea being that it's actually not random, that angels or gods will ensure that it opens to the right page to advise you and guide you in your moment of need. So Augustine picks up Scripture and flips it open, and you can look up in the Confessions exactly what the passage of Scripture is. It's a passage that we still have in the modern Bible. And it's this passage which basically says, stop sleeping around and put your full energy and faith into the Lord Jesus Christ. It says, stop your wantonness and chambering. Chambering meaning hopping around from bedroom to bedroom, and put your full faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. So this is the breaking point for Augustine. Somehow, at this time, in this time of need, seeing that particular passage was the tipping point. It was what allowed him to say, okay, God, I'm with you. In other words, this felt like you could imagine God is wagging his finger at Augustine a little bit too. Here, Augustine is complaining and asking God, how much longer do I have to wait? And God is saying, why are you asking me as if this is something you need to wait to have happen to you? This is something in your power. If you want to follow the Christian path, just stop doing A and start doing B. It's quite simple. So the message feels quite wise. It feels like tough love, a kind of tough love message, like God's sort of gently slapping Augustine's face to slap him out of his wailing episode, which is maybe a bit self-indulgent. And it was enough, as Augustine reports it in his autobiography. This was his conversion moment. This was the moment that allowed him to fully commit his life to God, and which led him to statehood. Okay, so Augustine did not know the word synchronicity, but if we look at what he's described to us, I think we could say this is a classic case of a synchronicity. Now, by calling it a synchronicity, we're not saying it was just a coincidence, nor are we saying it was definitely an act of God. In the way I'd like to use the word synchronicity today, we just mean it's a meaningful coincidence of some kind. And then it's a further question to be debated, what the cause of that coincidence, if anything, is. Okay, so Augustine would agree with us by that definition that this was definitely a synchronicity, and a religious skeptic could agree with us by that definition that it was a synchronicity, meaning a meaningful, rare coincidence. As I said, a coincidence always involves more than one element coming together to create the coincidence or the synchronicity. In this case, what are the elements? Well, depending on how you kind of divide it up or count it up, you could get maybe 2 or 3 or 4, but definitely we've got the child's singing of the Tolle Lege. Okay, that's something that's happening now. Now meaning, well, Augustine's asking a question, and then a child sings a kind of response. Okay, or sings something which could be taken as a response. So you've got 2 things coming together, kind of questioning from Augustine and then a kind of answering from the child. Those are 2 separate voices, 2 separate acts of communication, which happen together in an interesting way. And then you've got the flipping open of the Bible, right? I mean, again, depending on how you divide it up, you could say you've also got the coincidence that there happens to be a Bible close at hand, whether the copy of the friend or whatever copy was close at hand. There was a book close at hand that Augustine could pick up and read. You could say that itself should count as a separate element here. I mean, the more elements you have, the more unlikely the coincidence is, roughly speaking, right? If you think of the way probabilities are calculated, the more elements required for an event, the less likely the event is. Because each factor has its own weighting. And anyway, you've got the fact that there is a book available to Augustine to pick up, and then you've got the fact that the book opens to a passage that seems quite tailored to Augustine's particular situation. Okay, he's bemoaning the fact that he's mired in earthly lust and he can't commit to the life of Christ. And the very passage his eye lands on says, stop sleeping around and commit yourself to Christ. Okay, so it's a highly relevant passage. And so of all the passages in scriptures you could have landed on, now there are probably several, indeed many passages in the Bible which would have seemed relevant in some way to Augustine's particular dilemma here. This passage seems very nicely tailored to his dilemma, but skeptically we could ask maybe if the older Augustine writing this autobiography has, without necessarily consciously trying to mislead his reader, has we all like to tell a good story, including the story of our lives. And maybe, in fact, this dark day of the soul wasn't specifically about lust. That was one of many things that was holding Augustine back. And, there were also the heresies, these alternate philosophies and religions that Augustine was tempted by. And so a passage in the Bible, if randomly opened to, that said, stop indulging in these alternate gods, stop worshiping false gods, or that would have seemed relevant to Augustine too. But Augustine writing the autobiography and wanting to tell a good story, given the passage, let's assume he's telling the truth about which passage was randomly opened, this passage about lust. Maybe because of that lust-focused passage in the Bible, Augustine, in telling the story, characterizes his dark day of the soul as this conflict between lust and Christ. Because then that makes a very neat plot and plot resolution. So, when we think skeptically about these synchronicity examples, we need to think about all kinds of things like this, including how reliable the narrator's account of the synchronicity is. Yeah. But anyway, we were counting the elements, and I don't know, we got to 3 or 4, and you got these separate elements, and notice that if you look at each of these elements, there's a kind of natural explanation for each of them. Okay, take the child singing Tolle Lege. I'm quite sure, And I think it's safe for us all to assume, including Augustine, that if we could zoom our camera in on the child in their own backyard, 2 yards over from Augustine, and then actually follow the videotape, rewind it a bit, and see what led the kid out into the backyard, there will be a perfectly natural explanation for why the kid is there singing at that time and why they're saying this strange little thing. I mean, kids say all kinds of strange things. Why they're saying pick up and read. For example, here's one possible explanation of what's going on just purely within the kid's own causal stream of cause and effect and behavior, right? The kid was inside with their Latin tutor. Okay, the kid is we're in an upper middle class neighborhood. I don't know, and the kid is being tutored in his or her morning lessons, probably his morning lessons in Latin, and the kid, being energetic, a little slightly naughty kid, jumps up from their study table. The Latin tutor has just commanded them to pick up the book and read, to stop fooling around, stop fidgeting, pick up that book and read and study. And the kid just jumps up and is imitating, in the sing-songy voice, imitating their tutor's own command to pick up and read. The tutor says, pick it up and read. Get back to work. And the kid runs outside and is hopscotching around and saying, pick it up and read, pick it up and read, right? Something like that is going on. Totally natural. There's nothing supernatural happening there with the kid. Augustine crying at that time. I mean, if we just consider Augustine independent of the kid, Augustine's having a bad day. I mean, this happens. And we can, if we were a very astute psychologist or psychiatrist and we got to know Augustine, we could maybe give a nice explanation for why now in particular things have come to a head and Augustine is broken down and is crying and so on, right? Okay, so there's no special miraculous supernatural explanation needed for why Augustine is crying and why Augustine is crying out to God for assistance. Okay. Now, again, that there is a Bible close at hand requires no special explanation. I mean, Augustine was interested in Scripture, and I think his friends were, and I think maybe they were talking about it around this time. And this was a book which was often around Augustine, close to hand in his environment. So that's nothing special. That requires no special explanation. That the page should open in particular to this highly relevant passage, this passage which seems to answer Augustine's cried out question. That's the one element here which you might be tempted into a supernaturalist explanation. Okay, you might say it's so unlikely that the randomly selected passage should be so relevant that in itself becomes a kind of miracle. I don't think so. I think with just a kind of minimal mathematical conservatism, we could say odds are pretty decent that if you're a proto-Christian, you're someone who's considering the Christian path, and your crisis is a kind of Christian crisis, a crisis which is very common to people considering Christianity. The old battle between the flesh and the spirit is one of the main themes of the Bible, running through the entire story of the prophets and the people. And it's not really that unusual that you should land upon a passage which is relevant to your actually pretty stereotypical, pretty common inner conflict here. So relevant passage. It's a little surprising, but again, we might also ask, was this the first time Augustine ever did this? This is the kind of thing you've done 40 times over a month. You're going to remember 20 years later when you're writing your autobiography, or however many years later, you're going to remember the hits, not the misses. Yeah, you're going to remember the times. You remember the time you bought the winning lottery ticket. You forget about all the times you were scratching the losing ones. They all kind of blend together into one vague experience, but the winning, you remember, it was a cute detail the time you won $100,000. You remember taking the streetcar to the OLG office on Dundas Street West, and you remember the smile on the clerk's face as they handed you the big novelty-sized check and whatever. I mean, we remember the hits, especially many years later when we're recounting our life stories. So it could be that Augustine actually had flipped open the Bible randomly many times in his life, let's say 20 times or 200 times, and a few of those times were hits. So that would make the relevance of the randomly selected passage even less surprising, right? In other words, that element, the relevant passage in this synchronicity of many elements, doesn't require some kind of special explanation. We wouldn't consider it in itself a miracle, or we shouldn't. Okay. But, and here's really the key to understand synchronicities, that all of these things should be together, that they should happen in this kind of coordinated way is the unusual thing. And that's the thing, again, no law of nature has been violated, but we might ask, how is it that all of these things came together at just the right time, in just the right way to create a meaningful experience, so that the painter, maybe with some justness, has characterized the child's voice as the voice of God. It's as if God is speaking not just through the child, but through this whole conjunction of events. God is speaking to Augustine and responding to Augustine's prayer. Okay. Now, we've been contrasting synchronicities with objective miracles, but I mean, it's a little complicated. It's a little messy because there is a way you could try to explain what's happened to Augustine where it does involve intervention in nature by God, though even there, no strict rule breaking. That is, you can imagine, I mean, if we're imagining that God coordinated this scene, we could say that God, well, take the randomly selected passage. Let's say Augustine just kind of opened the book on a table. Okay, I'm not sure if it was in book form, actually, like in a codex form, but it's a little harder to imagine if it was a scroll being unrolled. But let's imagine it was a book, and Augustine puts it on the picnic table and flips it open, and whatever page kind of it settles on, as the pages kind of flutter down to each side of the splayed book, that's the page Augustine will look at. We could imagine God kind of blowing at the pages to make sure that the right page remains open for Augustine to read. That is, God wants Augustine to read this particular passage about lust and Christ. And so God kind of blows at the scene, blows, it intervenes in nature. If God hadn't blown at the Bible as Augustine opened it, it would have opened most likely to a much less relevant passage. So you could imagine that God kind of intervenes here in the natural course of things. And I guess that intervention would, in a subtle way, involve a violation of natural law. That is, if natural law, meaning physics, the physics of and the weather of books opening and reacting with the wind, ambient wind in the backyard and so on. I mean, if that had been left on its own, if that system of nature had been left on its own, the book would have opened to a much less relevant passage. So God has to intervene and kind of disrupt or take over nature. If you think of it that way, that does sound like an objective miracle, right? It's not as dramatic as someone walking on water or turning water into wine, but it is a subtle disruption of the natural course of things, and it would be an objective miracle then. But in a way, it's more interesting to imagine that what's going on here is that just like the child was doing the child's own thing in its own little world, it was singing Tolle Lege for its own reason. The Bible is just falling open to the page that it's going to fall open to, given the laws of physics as they actually operate, and given the breeze in the backyard at that time, and whatever other factors uh, are involved in getting the page to the page it gets to. Right, that the book is just following the natural course of things too. If that's what's going on, then we've got a synchronicity, right? Where we got a conjunction of events, which each element of which is a perfectly natural event. But then we might ask, how is it that they've come together in this very meaningful way? And if you think about it, a synchronicity, if God is involved in the synchronicity, is astounding. And actually more astounding than an objective miracle. Okay, let me explain that. If a synchronicity is coordinated by God, okay, but the synchronicity doesn't involve any violation of natural law, that implies something stupendous about God's power. To put it simply, miracles are relatively easy compared to coordinating a synchronicity. If you're God, and the question is, what's easier, to cause a miracle or to cause a synchronicity? It's much harder to cause a synchronicity. Why? Well, as we've defined a synchronicity, each element in the synchronicity has a purely natural explanation. And that means God is like this grand composer or orchestrator who, almost from the beginning of time, has set things in motion such that each element following just the natural course of things, the natural rules of the system we call natural law, they will come together in this super meaningful way on this day for Augustine, right? That God is working with the laws of nature, which means that God has to kind of, from the very beginning of time, from the Big Bang, has to have had it in mind that this would happen to Augustine, and had to kind of hit the different domino streams there at the very beginning, so that they would come together billions of years later in this very coordinated way. Again, like a composer, like a classical composer who has composed the whole score before the performance even happens. Which, again, is a lot harder. It implies total mastery of the natural system. Whereas miracles, a miracle, an objective miracle, could happen not by God, but by more like a hacker of the natural world, meaning, some kind of deity or demigod. Something very powerful relative to us, but it could be something that actually doesn't have total power over the system, something which most of the time has to follow the system, but has found a way just to temporarily hack it. Right, and we call that a miracle when we see a sudden and brief disruption in the natural course of things that looks to us like an objective miracle. The being who caused it was actually just a hacker who had temporary control over nature. But a synchronicity involves this grand total orchestration of the natural order, working purely within natural law to create these meaningful sort of signatures of God's intelligence and benevolence, right? So synchronicities subjectively make us stop and scratch our heads and go, wow, and write it down maybe and tell friends about it and maybe wonder about it. And indeed, if we follow that wondering through, as I just have, it is a pretty stupendous implication in terms of God's power, if you're going the religious route of explanation. Okay, so the question is whether we need to go the religious route of explanation. And one way of treating synchronicities is case by case. Like we've spent quite a bit of time now looking at Augustine's famous case, and I've tried to give a kind of religiously sympathetic reading of Augustine's case here as much as possible. But to counter this kind of religious interpretation of a synchronicity, we should consider alternate explanations of what's going on in the cases of these meaningful coincidences. So let's turn our attention now to some alternate explanations. Yeah. Okay. Psychological contributors to perception of synchronicities. Perception of. So a synchronicity is always perceived, yeah, because it's by definition a meaningful coincidence. Meaning implies a perceiver who finds the coincidence meaningful. And it might be that we are made to find meaning, and that we're so well made to find meaning that we find it even when we shouldn't find it. That is, we impose meaning and order and design and intention onto external events, even when those external events don't merit it. And we'll talk about a couple of these psychological propensities, tendencies we have, which might lead us to notice a synchronicity and tempt us into a supernatural or some kind of religious explanation of a synchronicity. Talking about selective perception first. This term selective perception is a very general term covering a wide class of psychological tendencies. What they all have in common is some kind of filtering of the data. That is, we, the experiencers, we, the perceivers, are filtering the data that come into us from the external world in a way which is biased. Okay, we discard some data and we focus on other data in a way which makes the world appear meaningful to us, even when there's nothing really going on out there. Okay, and here are a couple of examples of specific psychological phenomena which fall under the category of selective perception. The first one, I mean, you can Google this and look this up. This is quite a kind of an unwieldy name. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon is the name fairly recently given by psychologists to a particular linguistic example of selective perception. We are linguistic beings, and a lot of the data we receive is data from the social world of other linguistic communicators, and we filter that linguistic data in a particular way. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon is more specifically the linguistic filtering that results from learning a new word. Okay, you learn a new word, and then it seems to you that that word is appearing in your environment with increasing frequency. Well, I want to take a slightly self-referential example here, if it's not too confusing. Consider the term Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, or Baader-Meinhof. Let's say until today, until listening to this lecture, you had never heard, as far as you can tell, you had never heard that term before. And then now in the coming 4 weeks, you come across the term 5 times in different contexts. Okay. and you stop and scratch your head. It feels like a synchronicity, or something in the neighborhood of a synchronicity. Where, well, I guess it's a synchronicity, not happening at the exact time, but around the time you learn the term Baader-Meinhof, meaning today. Around that time, you start hearing the word Baader-Meinhof or reading the word Baader-Meinhof with increased frequency. That is over the next, what did I say, 4 weeks. Okay, so in that 4-week period, including today, that's the time there's this coincidence happening, okay, of multiple sightings of the term Baader-Meinhof. Okay, so the standard sort of natural psychological explanation of the phenomenon. The phenomenon is just the fact that this seems to happen, that there's this seeming increased frequency. The naturalist explanation of this phenomenon is that it is just a seeming, okay, that you've been primed for this term now that you've learned it, okay, and it's going to stand out in your environment now that you've been primed for it. The idea being that this is a term that actually comes up, okay, 5 times in 4 weeks does sound a little high, but it's a term that has come up in your reading experience before, or in your listening experience before, or it's been on billboards maybe before, billboard advertising this class maybe, but you just didn't notice it. It just kind of, it's like, I mean, the light reflecting off the billboard did hit your eyes and in some way was registered by your visual system, but it didn't register at the level of conscious registering. You didn't notice it in that sense because you hadn't been primed for it. It was just like noise to you. I mean, there's all kinds of noisy textual and linguistic data that's assaulting us every day, and a lot of it we just kind of ignore or filter out or don't pay attention to. But once you've been primed for a term, it stands out and you notice it. And that's, so now that you've been primed, you're going to notice it every time you see it, and you're going to count it and ask about it. Why am I seeing this word with increased frequency? I mean, notice there's a religious sort of explanation of why you see Baader-Meinhof 5 times in the next 4 weeks. We could say, you are a student, and you are a devoted student, and in your devotion to studying, the goddess Athena, the ancient goddess of wisdom and learning and libraries, has noticed you, and she has cast her favoring glance upon you from heaven, and she wants to aid you in your studying for this class. So you need to know the term Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, and she has given you some reinforcement learning over the next 4 weeks by making sure that in your environment this term appears 5 times. So she's, in other words, the goddess Athena, the goddess of learning, is acting as your supernatural language tutor and giving you flashcard reinforcement of this term. Okay, so that's that's a supernatural explanation. The naturalist explanation is this: it's just a case of selective perception. You know, you're selecting this term in the next 4 weeks from the field of perception because you've been primed to notice it. Outside of selective perception, I guess, or maybe still roughly under the umbrella of selective perception, there are perhaps other things going on in the case we're imagining. For example, it could be that if we look at the 5 times in the coming 4 weeks, you notice this term, it could be that you're in an environment in each of those 5 cases which is not random. That, you know, based on this course, you get interested in the psychology of perception and you start reading in that literature and following links in your web browsing in that area. And it just makes you more likely to come across this term now because this is a term from the psychology of perception. You know? So it's your first conscious recognition of this term, which is in this lecture, is part of the cause, relevant cause for your later instances of perceiving the term. Yeah, it's not just random. And so it could be actually that this term hasn't been appearing in your environment at all, even as noise, very much until you took this course. But now that you've taken the course, you're more likely to encounter it because you're moving through the world a little more curious about selective perception. And it's in those environments, those informational environments, you're more likely to see this kind of term. Yeah. So that could be part of what's going on too. Notice that we've talked about Baader-Meinhof as a linguistic phenomenon, and the standard case of it is learning a new word and then seeming to encounter that word with increased frequency. You could see by analogy the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon occurs with non-linguistic phenomena too. The classic case of that is you get interested in buying a, I don't know, Toyota Prius, if they still make those. A Toyota, you got to buy a new car, and you really narrowed it down to, you're really thinking about buying pulling the trigger on a Toyota Prius. And you seem, as you're driving down the 401 or whatever, you seem to see a lot of Priuses. It's almost as if the god of automobiles, Detroitus, is calling out to you and telling you to buy a Prius. But that would be a kind of Baader-Meinhof-like phenomenon where Priuses have been around, passing you on the 401, or you passing them all along, but now they're standing out to you because you're thinking, you got Priuses on the mind, right? Okay, so that's all selective perception, I think. The point being that, the question here for synchronicities is, to what extent are synchronicities actually at least partly structured by a Baader-Meinhof kind of phenomenon? And we shouldn't attribute the synchronicity to the goddess Athena if there's a simpler explanation available. And selective perception is a simpler explanation. Athena may or may not exist, to put it that way. Whereas selective perception definitely exists. We already know that exists. So it's in that sense a simpler, more plausible explanation. Okay, another broad category of selective perception goes by the name of pareidolia. And now you're going to see this term 5 times in the next 4 weeks, if you haven't learned this term already. And this is usually applied to perceptual data, usually visual and audio, though I guess you could get gustatory and olfactory and whatever else, pareidolia too. But most of the examples are visual or audio. And pareidolia is the case of imposing pattern or order or meaning on a noisy field of information, noisy or random or disorganized field of information. And the classic case of visual pareidolia is something we've probably all experienced, where you see faces in the shapes of clouds passing overhead, right? And the idea is that we are so primed to find meaningful structure out there in the world that it's very easy for us to make a cloud look like a face. That faces are one of the first things our perceptual and interpretive system goes to in deciding what it is we're looking at. It's as social animals who communicate to each other in large part through facial expression. We are very primed, probably biologically and certainly by cultural conditioning, to be very interested in human faces and to be, in a way, constantly scanning our environment for faces. In a way, the first thing you do when you walk into a room is you're scanning it for faces. The first judgment you make about the room, apart from lights on or off, is faces or no faces. Is this a no-face room or a face room? And If there are faces, you've got to pay special attention to that room, because it could be a face of someone who wants to hurt you, or it could be a face of someone who wants to mate with you, uh, or feed you, and and so we're on a hair trigger set to find faces in our environment, and so we are very, you could say, susceptible to pareidolia, especially pareidolia of a facial nature. And here's a classic case of a pareidolia, though I guess these are all debatable. I mean, whether this is just pareidolia or something else is in principle debatable. This is the famous face on Mars. So this is an actual photograph or detail of a photograph taken by the boy, was it the Pioneer or Voyager or one of the NASA missions? This was an unmanned, unpersoned mission, which was passing over the face of Mars, and I guess in 1976, getting our first close-up pictures of the surface of planet Mars. And this is one of the several pictures that came back to NASA ground control. This is a detail of a picture of it's called the Cydonia region of the surface of Mars for, mapping Mars. And this is about a couple kilometers in length. And wow, it really does look like a human face with half of the face kind of in shadow. There you can see the nostril and the very handsome chin cleft and deeply shadowed eyes, and even a kind of laurel or crown or something, and heavy sideburns, or just, or just a lot of healthy hair. This is interestingly a little spookily. It does look like a Greco-Roman statue. It looks like a kind of marble face, the austere, handsome, demigodic face of a Greco-Roman deity like Mars. And of course, the tabloids had a field day when they got a hold of these pictures, and they, with headlines as you check out your groceries in 1976, saying, NASA covering up evidence of ancient civilization on Mars. So the idea was that this was some huge monument that the ancient Martian civilization had built, kind of like our Sphinx or pyramid. If you look up face on Mars on Wikipedia, it will describe sort of what I've just described to you, the context and the background, and then we'll tell you that the standard explanation of what's going on here is this is just a case of visual pareidolia, where you've got kind of like a cloud, but in this case on the surface of the geological surface details, you've just got a lot of noise. And if you zoom out from this particular picture, you see just a lot of messy geological noise on the surface of Mars in the Cydonia region. And one of those little bits of noise, just like one cloud in particular passing overhead, might look like a face or a pirate ship or whatever. You got this one little region which happens to look quite face-like. So odds are, that of all the, noisy data that the space probe sends back to us, some of it is going to look face-like to us, given our propensity for facial pareidolia. I gotta say though, this particular example, it's such a great example because it does. Maybe the irrational part of my brain can't help but feel there's something more going on here. It's just so eerie. It's not just that it's a face. It's a very well composed face. It's a very artistically composed face, which can stand alongside, I think, some of our great examples of classical statuary. And more spookily, this was our first close up of a planet, if I'm not mistaken, right? Mars, our neighbor planet. This was our first close-up image of our. We finally reached with one of our probes the god planet. It was called Mars after the Greco-Roman god, and Romans maybe thought that the planet was the god. If you asked where is Mars, where is the god Mars, they might point to that starry point up in the heavens. And here we are finally arriving at the god Mars, and we take a picture and it greets us with this slightly imposing, slightly formidable face. It's a little bit spooky, you know. And you can, if you go to the Wikipedia page for Face on Mars, you'll see more recent photos of this exact region in the Cydonia region of Mars from the 1990s, I think, and even more recent, where it doesn't look like this anymore. I mean, you can see there's a mound there, and it's got some ridges, but it doesn't strike us as a face anymore. At most, it looks like a flattened mask or the template that a mechanical press might impress a face onto, but it really looks quite unformed and mound-like in more like in higher resolution pictures from more recent flybys. And you might say, well, therefore it was just a trick of shadow on that particular day at that particular moment of the flyby, which makes me, again, maybe the irrational part of my brain say, well, that makes it more extraordinary then that it wouldn't have looked like a face at any other time. It was just at that time, with the proper arrangement of the wind and the shadow, and that it would not wind, but assumedly wind has in the intervening years blown stuff around enough that it doesn't have quite this surface detailing. So in other words, only in 1976 at that time, with that level of photographic grain, or what's the word, resolution, would it have looked like this. In other words, Mars was ready for his close-up in 1976, just in time for us, knowing that we were flying by at that time, and then he decomposed his face after that. So it's a weird example. It's an eerie example, but okay, the classic explanation of it is that it's just a case of selective perception. More specifically, it's a case of visual pareidolia. Okay, and it's a case of how we impose meaning on noisy data. And the question for synchronicities then is, to what extent are synchronicities just us imposing meaning on noisy data? For example, well, I mean, is this the greatest example? But in the case of St. Augustine, the noise, what would the noise have been in that situation? All the things going on that day, and all the times he's cried out to God for help, and all the things that were bothering him that day, But once he gets the particular passage which talks about abandoning lust for Christ, then he imposes order on his day, and he starts thinking about his day, his day of the soul being a special day of the soul, the one, and he starts thinking about that dark day of the soul being specifically about the battle between lust and the path of Christ, and so he starts imposing specific meaning on that much messier environment. So that would be a case of not exactly visual pareidolia, but a pareidolia-like imposition of order on meaning. I mean, but you could also take just an actual case of visual pareidolia to itself be a synchronicity. I mean, that everything should look just like this at just this time when we're flying by. You could say that itself is a kind of synchronicity, a coming together of these events, which each have their own natural explanation. We don't have to suppose that a Martian civilization, bulldozed this face into being in a sculpturing way. We could say that just through wind and erosion and whatever else, this face emerges, just like we had our own reasons for flying by. In terms of technological history, we had our own reasons for flying by in 1976 for the first time, and not in 1996 for the first time. 1926. So there are these different elements coming together here, but they combine to create this very meaningful image. So you could say you could say some cases of pareidolia are themselves apparent synchronicities, but we can explain them more naturally as just cases of pareidolia. Yeah, and we don't have to resort to gods. But also, I would suggest that the fact that we are susceptible to visual and audio pareidolia is just a very vivid reminder to us that we have this tendency to impose meaning and order pattern on fairly noisy, meaningless data. And then we can ask, taking that lesson, we can ask, to what extent are we doing this when we notice these apparent or these synchronicities? Yeah. Okay, we're talking about synchronicities, and we're talking about critical or naturalistic explanations of synchronicities. And we've just talked about selective perception as a factor in the production of synchronicity experiences. And we're also now finally going to talk about innumeracy as a factor here. And in here is the negation, right? Like anti. And numeracy means competence with numbers. Innumeracy is incompetence with numbers. It's the mathematical equivalent of illiteracy, right? So if we're illiterate, we're incompetent with written language. And, well, incompetent is a harsh word, but anyway, I hope you get my point. Innumeracy is incompetence with numbers. And we could ask, what is the standard of competence we're operating with here? Well, in the context of synchronicities, the standard of numeracy is facility with probability calculations involving large numbers. Okay, or okay, maybe it doesn't need large numbers, but facility with, I think, complex probability calculations. How good are we at probability calculations? And maybe one of the lessons of innumeracy here, or the main lesson of innumeracy here, is that we're not, almost all of us are quite incompetent at probability calculation, especially when we're outside of the classroom, when we're not doing math, when we're out there in the world and experiencing these amazing coincidences. We're usually not employing a very precise kind of probability calculus. We're just making a very quick judgment when we say this is an amazing coincidence, and when we actually say this is such a strange coincidence, it has to be more than just a coincidence. It's a synchronicity that requires a supernatural explanation in terms of Athena or God talking to Augustine or whatever. When we make that kind of judgment, we're making a probability calculation. And I mean, taking Augustine's example, where you've got 3, 4, 5 different elements, each element needs its own kind of assignment of probabilistic value, and then you need to multiply each element by the other elements. The odds of each need to be multiplied in sequence to get some kind of final probability that conjunction should happen. And it's, first of all, just very difficult to assign probability value to any one of those things. Like just take the passage of the Bible that the book opens to when Augustine. What are the odds that a highly relevant passage should be arrived at through that random procedure? Well, that's a lot harder to answer than, what are the odds of rolling a 3 on a 6-sided die? The odds of that are 1 in 6. The odds of arriving at a spiritually relevant passage to Augustine's particular concerns of that day are much harder to calculate. We've got to decide how to count up biblical passages. Maybe we'll just count pages or something. Pages with what percentage of biblical pages have relevant messages on them to Augustine's time of need here. What are the odds that a child or some other carrier of vocal information should be in the vicinity during the hour or 5 minutes or whatever it is that Augustine was crying, and should say something that is instrumental to get Augustine to flip open the Bible, or do something else that will be revelatory for Augustine. I mean, how do we assign numbers to these things? There might be you can do your best. We could sit down and do our best. I've been trying to kind of just improvised and out loud begin a kind of probability calculation for Augustine there, but you can see it's actually very difficult. And it doesn't seem like Augustine tried to do anything like that. Augustine assumed this was God talking to him. And to assume that, you've got to assume that there's no way that these things could have happened just sort of randomly, And so, in effect, Augustine has made a probability calculation and concluded that there's no way it could just be a coincidence, that God had to be behind this. And so Augustine is acting innumerately in that he actually hasn't taken the time to do a proper probability calculation. He's jumping to a probability conclusion with insufficient attention to the details. The actual math of the probability could be fairly simple if it's just multiplying fractions, but and most of us can do that. But it's the assigning of the probabilities and just taking the time to actually do that. and so the critical idea of a numeracy here, that is when we're using the fact of a numeracy, the fact of our mutual innumeracy, to explain synchronicities, we're saying maybe what's going on in a lot of synchronicity stories or experiences is people are just jumping to a probabilistic conclusion. Okay, so a common kind of amazing coincidence that people will often talk about is someone calling them or texting them right when they're thinking of them. And now this is usually not taken to be evidence of God necessarily. Usually it's taken to be evidence of some kind of psychic connection between the caller and the receiver. But in any case, it's taken to be some kind of amazing coincidence that requires some further explanation by a lot of people who experience this kind of thing. So you're thinking of your mom, and your mom calls. Ring, ring. Hello? Hi, honey. How are you? Wow, I was just thinking of you, Mom. Okay. And you say, what are the odds of that? Well, indeed, what are the odds? Not that low, actually. They're pretty good. Let's say you think about your mother 1% of the time. Well, then the odds are 1 in 100 that a call will happen while you're thinking of her, right? Right? Out of 100 moments, in one of those, you're thinking of your mom. So, and then calls come from your mom, let's say relatively randomly, or independent of your thinking of her. And it's just odds are, just by chance alone, without any kind of psychic connection or intervention by Hermes, the god of communication, your mom's going to call right when you're thinking of her. That's going to happen 1 in 100 times. So when you say, gee, Mom, what are the odds? Your mother, being a mathematician, would say 1 in 100, probably. Hopefully higher, because you're thinking of me more than 1 in 100 moments. I mean, that's part of the problem here. It's not just the calculation, it's the vagueness of these categories. So thinking about your mother, I mean, our thoughts aren't like these binary phenomena that are on or off in our brain. I mean, if you're a Freudian, probably in some way you're always thinking about your mother, if only indirectly, So for a Freudian, it's highly likely your mom's going to be calling you right when you're thinking of her. Your mom is maybe one of the great unsignified signifiers in your symbolic system, and you're so you're always thinking of her. Anyway, ask yourself, at least ask yourself, what are the odds? And it might turn out that they're not as low as you think, right? It's only if the odds are super, super, super low that you should begin seeking an alternate, non-natural explanation of what's happened, or extraordinary explanation of what's happened. The greatest coincidence would be if there were no coincidences. A mathematician said that. You can Google and find out who, but as I said earlier, lots of stuff is happening. The world is a busy place. And because there's so much stuff happening, once in a while things are going to happen together in a way which seems super meaningful to us. So extraordinary coincidences are mathematically expected. They're expected to happen once in a while. Not all the time, but once in a while. They're extraordinary. They're a little bit unusual, but still they're going to happen. There's a series of books called Small Miracles. The first, this is a cover shot of the first one. Came out in 1997, and there've been a whole. It's it's like chicken soup for the soul. There's been a whole series of them since then, like Small Miracles for dads and whatever else. But it's a very interesting read. It's a compilation of, I think, what we would today call synchronicity stories, and some of them they really are amazing. I mean, there's some incredible stories in there, and now possibly some of the stories are the result of lying or misremembering of the event. So some amount of that has gone into the telling and compilation of these stories. But assume that the stories are true, and they are amazing. I mean, some of the stories in there, I would say, are the kinds of coincidences that don't happen to most of us in the course of a lifetime. Like if you live 80 years on Earth, you're going to have some really funny coincidences happen to you. But the ones the ones worthy of being compiled into the Small Miracles book are it's like the best of human coincidence stories. And so they're amazing, but they are the cream of human coincidence stories, right? That across the whole human race, the very best, like the 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million coincidence stories are going to be insanely amazing, super, super unusual, and the odds of that thing happening to you are very, very low, very, very low. Just like the odds of winning a lottery are very, very low, but someone's going to win the lottery. The odds that someone wins the lottery are very high. So the odds that someone's going to have a small miracle, so to speak, happen to them are very high. Among 8 billion humans, the odds that it happens to you are very low. Okay, talking now about what's called divine command theory. This is a theory about the relationship between God or gods and ethics or morality, right and wrong. So in most religious worldviews, if not by definition of a religious worldview, there's some kind of instruction on how to live our lives and how to treat each other. You could think of the golden rule, which is expressed in various ways through various traditions, to love your neighbor or to do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. It goes in various forms, but that would be an example of a sort of rule of conduct, a moral rule or ethical rule. The rules could get more specific. They could be very specific rules about what to eat and what not to eat, rules about sexual behavior and the treatment of the elderly or the treatment of children. So the rules could be of a fairly general nature, they could be of a specific nature, but in most religious traditions, there's some relationship there between these rules and God. God is telling us or encouraging us to behave in a certain way, and we could ask, well, what exactly is the relationship between God and these rules? How is morality or ethics uh, grounded in or otherwise related to God? And divine command theory is a candidate answer to the question of the relationship between God and ethics. I think we can sort of dispense with it fairly quickly. It's that is to say, I I think it's a bad theory about the relationship between God and morals, but it could at least clear the way for a better theory. It's a tempting theory. It's sort of a candidate. It's maybe one of the first things you'll think of if you're trying to connect God to morals. And there's a neat little argument we're going to look at, a famous argument from way back in the history of philosophy, which shows there's a real problem with this divine command theory. Suppose that God commands us to do A. Okay, A is just our variable placeholder here for an action of some kind, to do whatever. Could be love your neighbor. It could be don't mix dairy and meat. It could be something about contributing a portion of your income to charity. Whatever. We're not concerned here with what the rules should be, what God should command. We're questioning this general relationship between God and these actions, which are being here prescribed action if we're being told to do A. Okay, God commands us to do A. Forget about questions of how we know that God commanded us to do A. Let's say we've got clear evidence that God commanded us to do A from a reliable prophet or from some kind of direct radio transmission from heaven. Okay. Well, is it good to do A because God commands it? Or, second option, that God commands it because it's good to do A. These are the two options for the relationship between these commands and the things they're commanding. Let's say doing A is donating to charity. A is donating to charity. God commands us to do A, to donate to charity. And we're asking now, okay, what's the relationship between the command and the action? Is it that it's good to donate to charity because God has commanded it? God's commanding it is what makes it a good thing to do? Or is it that it's already a good thing to do? Donating to charity is a good thing to do, and that's why God commands it. See the difference between these two? In the first case, the goodness of A is dependent on God's commanding. God's commanding is a very powerful thing. It's what sort of creates morality. So and option one here is what expresses divine command theory. Divine command theory is basically option one. It's the view that what makes any action good to do is that God commands us to do it. So according to divine command theory, God is very, very powerful, and God's power includes the power, really the exclusive power, the monopoly on power to create morality. Create's kind of a weird word, I think, around morality, but it's ground morality, justify morality. It's God's commanding that does it. Okay, so that's divine command theory. The second option is that it's already good to donate to charity or whatever the good action is. You know? And God commands it because God just recognizes, being omniscient and wise, God recognizes what's good and is sort of reminding us or revealing to us what's good to do. God's relation here to morality is much weaker, I guess you could say, than it is in divine command theory. In the second view, God doesn't create morality by God's commands. God is maybe some kind of moral teacher or guide, assumedly a perfectly reliable guide, right? I mean, God's commands are still important in the second case because God, being omniscient, would guide us well towards the moral actions. God, if God tells us to do it, we can trust that it's the right thing to do. But that's just because God is really smart, and God sees correctly what the right thing to do is, and then shares that information with us in some kind of revelation. Okay. Now, this pair of options, when we set it up as this kind of pair of options which you have to choose between, is called the Euthyphro dilemma. Euthyphro because it was first elucidated by Socrates in ancient Greece, and we have a transcript, maybe I could call it, of Socrates in conversation talking about this in a little piece of literature called the Euthyphro. It's the Euthyphro is a possible transcript or something like a transcript of Socrates explaining this problem to a young fellow named Euthyphro in ancient Athens. And they're discussing something like this. I won't get into the exact details of what's going on in the Euthyphro situation is a little bit different in ancient Greece, but by sort of analogy or extension, we generate this problem for theism. It's a problem or it's a dilemma because there seems to be, now maybe in the end, in fact, I will argue that it's not a real problem for theism, but on the face of it, there seems to be a problem here for theism, for belief in God, because each option has a problem, presents a problem for our conception of God. So let's talk about what the apparent problem is for each of these options, and then we'll talk about what the right solution is here, actually. So looking at the first option of this dilemma, a dilemma is a pair of options, each of which seems bad or unsavory or unpalatable or otherwise like a bad option. But it seems like you only have a choice between those two options. One way out of a dilemma is to show that, hey, actually, look over here. There's a third option we didn't notice. So it's not a true dilemma. There's a third option beyond the initial two that we can take. That's pretty good. Or you can dissolve a dilemma, solve a dilemma by saying, look, this first option actually isn't so bad, or this second option actually isn't so bad if we think about it a bit more. And so let's take the second option. So we're going to solve the dilemma by that second option. We're going to take the second option here of the two of the two options presented in the dilemma. I think there really is a problem for God if we take option one. I mean, this makes morality arbitrary. And by arbitrary, we mean without good reason. Um, if A becomes good simply because God commands it, that doesn't at all explain what makes it good. God commanding it in and of itself doesn't make it good. It seems to leave out in this account anything resembling a moral reason for A. Mm-hmm. And you could see this, I think, quite acutely if you imagine God commanding something terrible. If God tomorrow commands us to devote all of our waking hours energy to torturing each other or something, if God enjoins us to become sadistic in our impulses and to make our lives a testament to sadism, like Marquis de Sade or something, I think we want to protest. We want to say, God's commanded the wrong thing. And if you have that thought that God has commanded the wrong thing, what you're saying is there are independent reasons for assessing actions and rules about actions, and they're independent of God's commanding it or not, right? So mere commandment, whether it's from God or a king or the parliament, doesn't make something good. Rather, option two, God or Parliament, if they're operating well, will command the right things. They'll tell us to do those things which are good to do. And we figure out what's good to do through independent moral reasoning, right? We look at the action or the rule and we ask what would the consequences of it be, perhaps, if we're thinking in this kind of consequentialist way about morality. There might be other ways of thinking reasonably about what the right thing to do is, but the point is there need to be reasons for the action or the rule, which are independent of who happens to be commanding it, and God should be included in that 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 demand too. Yeah. Now, the initial reason you might think option two is bad news for theism is in this second account of the relation between God and morality, we seem to threaten God's omnipotence, right? We're saying that the moral law, the correct facts about what we should do and what we shouldn't do are somehow independent of God and God's power. And God has to abide by those rules. God, to be good, needs to follow these rules, which are not declared by anyone higher than God. They just have a kind of independent existence. So by moral law here, we don't mean a law declared by someone other than God. We just mean, by moral law, we mean something like the moral facts, the facts of what's right and wrong to do objectively. Yeah. And so in this picture of the relation between God and morality, the moral law seems to be greater than, remember that symbol for math, greater than God. And so you've got something out of God's control, superior to God, and that seems a threat to God's omnipotence and maybe some other omnis too. But so that's the worry, that if we take this second option, we've then threatened God's omnipotence. That is, if we believe this, then we actually believe that God isn't omnipotent. And then, strictly speaking, that means we don't believe in God anymore, because God, by definition, is omnipotent. So this is thought to be a bad option. Well, it's a pretty good option, actually. Notice that mathematical law, too, or the mathematical facts, are greater than God, if you want to put it that way. They're independent of God. And God knows all math. God is omniscient, so knows that 2 plus 3 equals 5, and much more complicated things than that too, I'm sure. But God simply, in God's omniscience, recognizes what the mathematical truths are. And hey, if God wants to, God could declare a 10 Commandments to Moses of mathematical law too. God seems less interested in math in the biblical account than he seems to be interested in morality. And that's why the 10 Commandments are focused on behavior, social behavior. But for both math and morals, you could imagine God simply, in God's omniscience, recognizing what the facts are and then sharing that with us, just saying, hey, here are the right things to do, and hey, here's how to add, subtract, multiply, sum a series, sum an infinite series, and so on. And I think a lot of theists would accept that math is not dependent on God, and it doesn't need to be. It's no threat to God's omnipotence to point out that God simply recognizes what's true mathematically, and that God can't make 2 plus 3 equal 7. Okay? God cannot make 2 plus 3 equal 7 if we're using the words 2 and 7 and plus and equals and whatever else in the way we currently use them in English, right? Assuming current usage for those terms, God can't make 2 plus 3 equal 7. And that doesn't mean that God isn't omnipotent. I mean, you could say it's a very extreme, unreasonably extreme view of omnipotence to demand that omnipotence requires the ability to make mathematical truths whatever you want them to be. And similarly, it's a slightly different case, but maybe similar enough. There are moral facts. They might be harder to figure out than facts of arithmetic, but let's say there are moral facts, and God just recognizes those and shares that information with us. If you're happy with that picture of God's relationship to math, and I think most believers would be okay with that, then maybe by analogy, you could be happy with this relationship of moral law to God. And it's not really greater than, it's more like independent of. The moral law is independent of God, and God just knows what it is. I mean, in a way, God's... Okay, I won't go there. That would just confuse things. All right. So the Euthyphro dilemma gave us two options, and I agree. The first option is not good for God or morality, and so we don't want to take that option. But the second option, actually, if we think it through, we think about this relationship or similarity, the second option is not bad for God, and it's certainly good for morality. Gives a more plausible picture of what makes things right and wrong. And so we should just take the second option, I think, if we are theists. Yeah. And then we might go into more detail on what makes it good to do it. So if it's not that God's commands make a good, right? Then we might want to say a bit more on what it is then that makes a good. And there are different answers to that, both religious and non-religious. And we're not going to really get into that here. But But we've ruled out, I think, divine command theory. It's a bad theory, and it's better to think of things this way. Yeah.